The captain was still sitting at his desk. His pen was in his hand. The logbook was open in front of him, the inkwell beside it, and the last sentence he had been writing trailed off mid-word, as if he had simply stopped. Not fallen, not collapsed. Stopped. His body was frozen solid, preserved by the Arctic cold so perfectly that the boarding party from the whaler Herald could see the expression on his face. Behind him, on the bunk, a woman lay wrapped in a blanket with a young boy pressed against her side. They looked, according to every version of the story, as though they were sleeping. They had been dead for 13 years. If this is your first time here, subscribe and like. This channel tells the darkest true stories of the ocean, and they only get worse. 28 men, a woman, and a child found frozen aboard a ship that had been drifting through the Arctic ice for over a decade, perfectly preserved, still in the positions they had been in when death came for them. And if the logbook was telling the truth, the ship they died on had done something that no living crew had ever accomplished. She had sailed the Northwest Passage. The crew just wasn't alive to know it. The story begins in 1761 when the Octavius, a three-masted schooner, departed London bound for the Orient. She was a trading vessel carrying English goods to the markets of China, an unremarkable ship on an unremarkable voyage that thousands of merchant vessels made every year. She carried a crew of 28, and, unusually, the captain's wife and young son, who were accompanying him on the long journey east. The Octavius reached her destination safely and spent weeks offloading cargo and taking on new goods for the return trip to England. Everything had gone according to plan. Then the captain made the decision that killed everyone aboard. The weather that year had been unseasonably warm. Ice that normally blocked the northern sea routes had retreated further than anyone in living memory had seen. The captain, emboldened by the conditions, and perhaps dreaming of the fame that would come with the achievement, decided to return to England not by the conventional route south around the Cape of Good Hope, but by sailing north through the Northwest Passage, the legendary sea route connecting the Pacific to the Atlantic through the frozen channels of the Canadian Arctic. No ship had ever completed the Northwest Passage. Explorers had been searching for it since the 1500s. Driven by the dream of a shortcut between Europe and Asia that would avoid the months-long voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, or the even more treacherous passage around Cape Horn. The English, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese had all sent expeditions north. All of them had failed. Martin Frobisher tried in 1576 and turned back. Henry Hudson tried in 1610 and was set adrift by his own mutinying crew in the bay that now bears his name. He was never seen again. The passage would not be successfully navigated until 1906, when Roald Amundsen completed it in a specially designed vessel with a crew of 6, and it took him 3 years. In 1762, attempting the Northwest Passage was not bold. It was suicide. The channels were unmapped. The ice was unpredictable, capable of closing around a ship in hours and holding it for months or years. The cold was lethal, dropping to temperatures that could kill an unprotected man in minutes. The darkness of the Arctic winter lasted months, leaving crews trapped in total blackness with nothing to do but wait and burn through their supplies. And the distances were so vast that if a ship became trapped, there was no one within 1,000 miles to rescue her and no way to walk to safety across the ice fields that stretched in every direction to the horizon. The captain of the Octavius looked at the warm weather, looked at the retreating ice, and decided that this was the year the passage could be done. He was wrong. The Octavius entered the passage sometime in the late autumn of 1762. She was never heard from again. After a reasonable period of waiting, the ship was declared lost at sea. Her owners wrote off the vessel. The families of the crew mourned their dead. The Octavius passed into the category of ships that the ocean had simply taken, another name added to a list that grew longer every year. What happened inside the Octavius during her final weeks can be reconstructed from what we know about Arctic survival, or more precisely, the failure of Arctic survival. The ship would have entered the passage with confidence, threading between the islands and ice shelves of the Canadian Arctic while the weather held. Then the temperature dropped. The ice closed in. Within days, possibly hours, the channels that had been open water became solid walls of white, and the Octavius was locked in place, unable to move forward or backward, imprisoned in a frozen landscape that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The crew would have known almost immediately that they were in trouble. Provisions that were adequate for a sailing voyage would not sustain them through an Arctic winter. The cold crept into the ship through every seam and joint, turning the interior into a refrigerator and then a freezer. The men would have burned everything they could: furniture, spare timber, rope, to keep fires going. But fuel would have run out long before the ice released its grip. Hypothermia kills slowly. It begins with shivering and confusion, progresses to numbness and lethargy, and ends with the body simply shutting down, organ by organ, as the core temperature drops below the point where life can be sustained. The last stages can look almost peaceful. The dying stop shivering. They stop feeling cold. Some of them, in the final delirium, feel warm. They curl up under blankets. They sit down at desks. They close their eyes. And they do not open them again. If the story of the Octavius is true, 28 men, a woman, and a child died this way, one by one, over a period of days or weeks, in a ship trapped in ice 250 miles north of the nearest inhabited land. The last one to die was probably the sailor with the tinderbox, still trying to start a fire in a cabin where everyone else was already dead. 13 years later, on October 11th, 1775, the whaling ship Herald was working the frigid waters west of Greenland. It was late in the season, the kind of weather that pushes even experienced whalers toward shore, and the crew of the Herald was preparing to head south when they spotted something on the horizon. A ship, 3 masts, sails still hanging from the yards, though they were tattered and torn, bleached by years of sun and wind and ice. The ship was drifting without direction, locked in a slow rotation with the current. No flag flew from her mast. No crew appeared on deck. The captain of the Herald sent a boarding party of 5 men across to investigate. They climbed onto the deck and found it deserted, covered in a thin crust of ice that cracked beneath their boots with every step. The rigging above them was frozen stiff, the ropes coated in frost so thick they looked like white bones against the gray sky. The deck fittings were rusted. The woodwork was bleached and weathered by years of exposure. The ship looked old in a way that went beyond normal aging, as if she had been sailing for so long without human hands that the ocean itself had started to reclaim her. The hatch was sealed shut, frozen closed. The boarding party broke it open with an axe and descended the ladder into the semi-darkness below. The cold hit them first. The interior of the ship was colder than the outside air, a deep preserved cold that had been sealed below deck for years. The air smelled of nothing. Not rot, not salt, not wood, nothing. The cold had killed even the smell of death. What they found would become one of the most famous and most terrifying images in maritime history. Every member of the crew was below deck, all 28 of them. They were frozen solid, preserved by the Arctic cold in the exact positions they had been in when they died. Some were in their bunks. Some were sitting against the walls of the crew quarters. All of them were dead, and all of them looked as though they had simply stopped living in the middle of whatever they had been doing, as if death had come so quickly and so quietly that none of them had time to react. The boarding party moved through the ship to the captain's cabin. The door was closed. They opened it and stepped inside. The captain sat at his desk, his body rigid and frosted, a pen still gripped in his right hand. The logbook was open on the desk in front of him, the inkwell beside it, undisturbed. He had been writing when he died, and the cold had frozen him in place before he could set down the pen. Behind him, on the cabin's bunk, lay his wife, wrapped in a heavy blanket, and beside her, their son, a young boy, naked beneath a second blanket that had been pulled over him. They were huddled together for warmth. They had not found enough. In the corner of the cabin, the boarding party found the body of a sailor clutching a tinderbox. He had been trying to start a fire. The steel and flint were still in his hands. He had died before he could make a spark. The 5 men from the Herald were by this point terrified. They grabbed the captain's logbook and FLD. In their haste, the frozen pages of the book cracked and broke apart in their hands. The middle section of the logbook, frozen solid and brittle, slipped from the binding and fell to the deck. The boarding party did not stop to pick it up. They ran. They climbed back over the railing, dropped into their boat, and rowed back to the Herald as fast as they could. They never returned to the Octavius. The Herald sailed away that night. By morning, the ghost ship had drifted out of sight, carried by the wind and the current into the gray emptiness of the Arctic. She was never seen again. Back aboard the Herald, the captain examined the fragments of the logbook his men had salvaged. They had only the first few pages and the last few pages, the middle of the record having been lost on the deck of the Octavius when the frozen binding cracked apart in their hands. The pages they did have were stiff with ice and had to be thawed carefully before they could be read. The ink had faded, but was still legible. What remained told a story that was simple, devastating, and, if true, unprecedented. The first pages confirmed the ship's identity and her departure from England in 1761. They recorded a routine outbound voyage, the kind of entries that appear in thousands of logbooks from the era: wind direction, weather conditions, position, course. The Octavius was an ordinary ship on an ordinary voyage. Nothing in the early pages suggested that anything would go wrong. The last pages told the rest of the story. The final entry in the logbook was dated November 11th, 1762. The ship's last recorded position was 75 degrees north, 160 degrees west, approximately 250 miles north of what is now Utqiagvik, Alaska, the northernmost point on the American continent. The Octavius had entered the Northwest Passage from the Pacific side, sailed north along the coast of Alaska, and become trapped in the ice somewhere above the Arctic Circle. The crew had frozen to death in the winter of 1762. For 13 years, the ice held the ship, carrying her slowly eastward through the very passage that had killed her crew, until she emerged on the other side, off the coast of Greenland, and drifted into the path of the Herald. If the story is true, the Octavius was the first ship to complete the Northwest Passage. Her crew accomplished what centuries of explorers had failed to do. They simply were not alive to know it. The passage that had defeated Frobisher, that had killed Hudson, that would defeat Franklin 70 years later with 2 ships and 129 men, had been conquered by a ship full of the dead. The Octavius did not sail the passage. The passage sailed her, pushing her through on its own schedule, at its own pace, taking 13 years to deliver a ghost ship from one ocean to another. It is the most extraordinary achievement in the history of exploration, and it was accomplished by no one. This is one of the most compelling ghost ship stories ever told. It is also almost certainly not true. There is no primary source for the story of the Octavius. No official record of the ship's construction, ownership, departure, or loss has ever been found. No record of the whaler Herald or her captain exists in any known maritime archive. The captain's logbook, the only physical evidence that would confirm the story, was never seen again after the boarding party carried its fragments back to the Herald. No museum has it. No collector has claimed it. No pages have ever surfaced. The first known appearance of a story matching the Octavius in published form is a tale about a ship called the Gloriana, found by the whaler Try Again under Captain John Warrens, described in a book published in 1905. The details are nearly identical: a frozen crew, a captain at his desk with a pen in his hand, a logbook with a last entry dated November of 1762, a ship that had been missing for 13 years. The only significant difference is the name of the ship and the absence of any mention of the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage detail appears to have been added later, possibly by a different author, turning a strange but relatively simple story about a frozen crew into an epic tale of posthumous exploration. It is worth noting that the Octavius story shares specific details with another maritime legend, the story of the schooner Jenny, an Antarctic ghost ship supposedly found in 1840 with her crew frozen at their posts and her captain at his desk with a pen in his hand. The Jenny story predates the Octavius in some tellings and postdates it in others. The overlapping details suggest that one story may have inspired the other, or that both may have been drawn from the same pool of sailors' tale that circulated through the ports of the Atlantic world for centuries. None of this means the Octavius definitely did not exist. Ships were lost in the Arctic regularly in the 18th century, and it is entirely possible that a vessel became trapped in the ice. Her crew froze, and the ship drifted for years before being found by another vessel. The Arctic is a place where this can happen, and has happened. In 1845, the British explorer Sir John Franklin entered the Northwest Passage with two ships, the Erebus and the Terror, and a crew of 129 men. Every single one of them died. The ships were not found for over 160 years. The Arctic does not return what it takes. It freezes it, preserves it, and sometimes, decades later, releases it back into the world looking exactly as it did the day it died. What is questionable is not the possibility of the event, but the specific details that make the story so memorable. The pen in the captain's hand, the wife and child on the bunk, the sailor with the tinderbox, the 13-year drift through the Northwest Passage. These are the details of a story, not a report. They are constructed for maximum emotional impact, arranged to create a narrative arc that builds from discovery to horror to wonder. Real events are rarely so perfectly composed. Real death is messy, chaotic, and devoid of the poetic symmetry that the Octavius story depends on. A captain frozen mid-sentence at his desk is literature. A crew frozen in their bunks after weeks of starvation, hypothermia, and despair is history. The two rarely look the same. The Octavius is a ghost ship in the truest sense. Not because she was haunted, but because she herself may be a ghost. A story that drifts through history, without an anchor, without a port of origin, without documentation to confirm that she ever existed. She has been repeated in hundreds of books, articles, and documentaries, as though she were a matter of historical record. She is not. She is a legend, and the line between legend and history in the world of maritime mysteries is as thin and as treacherous as the ice that supposedly killed her crew. But here is the truth about legends at sea. The ocean creates them because the ocean needs them. For every ship that returns to port with a story that can be verified, there are 100 that never return at all. The Octavius may not have existed, but the experience she represents, a ship trapped in the ice, a crew dying slowly in the cold, a vessel drifting for years through waters that no one can reach, that experience was real and repeated and horrifyingly common in the age of sail. The Arctic killed ships by the dozen. Most of them left no story at all. The Octavius, whether real or invented, gave a face to all of them. A face frozen mid-sentence, pen in hand, writing a logbook that no one would read for 13 years. The Octavius was never seen again after the Herald sailed away. The logbook pages that were dropped on her deck are presumably still there, frozen in the hold of a ship that is either resting on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean or still drifting somewhere in the ice. And the captain is still sitting at his desk, still holding his pen, still writing the sentence he never finished. If you want to hear the stories of what else the sea has taken and never returned, subscribe. There is always another ship that never came home.